A Report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 15. The trouble with biology, said Mr. Bales, is it doesn't go boom and it doesn't look good on television. It lacks glamour. So the boys at the AEC get half the research money. NASA puts on a TV show from the moon and gets the other half. And Fort Detrick gets closed down. They sat in Fergus's cabin around the long trestle table. The sun above had passed high noon. Mr. Bales had taken an assortment of papers from his steel briefcase. Beside them, Colonel Attenborough placed 3 books, one in English, one in German, one in Spanish. "You're opposed to that?" said Fergus. "In a way, yes," said Mr. Bales. "I know all the arguments, but there are counter-arguments, too. They just don't get listened to, and it's partly because of that lack of glamour. Biology right now is the hottest, fastest-moving science there is. It's stupid to neglect it. It's about where physics was just before the war, on the brink of almost everything. Life from a test tube. What kind of life? Any kind you can name, but more important, kinds you can't name. Fergus knows all about that. There never was a bee virus until he made it." "And there isn't one now," said Fergus. "You didn't let it out. But now that you've shown how, there will be others, and who knows what they'll be used for. It's a frightening idea, but unlike the H-bomb, it doesn't make you gasp. It's merely loathsome, and it makes you crawl. Take our own simple example. If the Russians built a missile launcher at Villa Petrograd, we'd publish the aerial photographs, or threaten to, and they'd have to tear it down. But what can we do with an invisible biologist working with invisible bacteria?" "If that's what he's doing," said Fergus. Colonel Attenborough looked startled. "You have doubts?" "I have a lot of questions. First, about the water samples from the river. Your messenger brought the analysis last night. Nothing very startling. However, on my way back from the medical library, I stopped at the Washington Sanitary Engineer's office and got this." He handed a mimeographed sheet of paper to Colonel Attenborough, who looked at it and passed it to Mr. Bales. "It took me all of 3 minutes to get it, and nobody asked me who I was or why I wanted it." Mr. Bales studied the sheet with a puzzled expression. "It looks familiar, doesn't it?" said Fergus. "It does. Let me see those analyses again. I'll save you the trouble. That's a profile of the water that comes out of every faucet in Washington, every drinking fountain in the Pentagon, all the taps and sinks in the White House, and the Mayflower. It's printed up twice a week and is available to the public. It has the bacteria count, halogen content, trace percentages of sodium, iron, calcium, all the rest. Perfectly normal city drinking water, taken from a mildly polluted river and run through a purification plant. The water in the bottle I filled from Dr. Schutz's intake pipe is, of course, that polluted river water, but the samples from his outflow match exactly the water from the Washington city system. He isn't putting germs into the water, he's taking them out. You think, Colonel Attenborough said, that for some reason he's built a purification system? Not just a system, but a miniature model of Washington's own system. It isn't hard to see why, that is, if you don't look too closely. His papers, the ones we've read, tell us he's working with waterborne bacteria, anthracis, and others, so it's logical to try out his various strains on the system where they're to be applied, that is, if things get to that stage. He needs to find out which of his mutants will survive to come out of the tap, but of course he doesn't want, or his employers don't want, and he's got strict orders, to put any real germs in the real water supply, not yet, so he's built a duplicate system." Mr. Bales said, But our analysis found no exotic bacteria in his output." "No. What we got was some overflow. He runs the system regularly, but of course he uses only a fraction of the water for actual experimentation. The rest he just pumps back into the river. But any water he contaminates he'll keep. First, because they told him to. Second, because he wants to test it. You can be sure he's got some kind of retaining tank at the laboratory." "He has," said Mr. Bales. "It shows in the aerial photographs. It looks like a small swimming pool. We wondered what the tank was for." "So," said Colonel Attenborough, "he can practice wiping out Washington twice a day and work it up to peak efficiency. A nice arrangement. It would seem," Fergus took back the mimeographed sheet, "if, as I said, you don't look at it too closely. But if you do, to me at least, it seems to fall apart. Think about this sheet of paper. Also, consider the fact that the Russian embassy is in downtown Washington and that Villa Petrograd is where it is. And all that was true before Dr. Schutz ever came here. I'm not sure I follow you. I mentioned that I got that paper from the engineer's office. Anybody can get one, including anybody from the Russian embassy. If they should want to check it for accuracy, they can fill a bottle from their kitchen sink in Washington and analyze it. Any commercial laboratory can do it. Or they can fly it to Moscow and run it through their own lab. In the same way, if they want a sample of the untreated river water, again, they can pick it up at any time just outside their gate at Villa Petrograd. Those two samples, before and after, are all they need. Colonel Attenborough looked merely puzzled, but Mr. Bales looked as if he were comprehending something he could not quite believe. Are you implying? I'm implying that there is no reason at all for Dr. Schutz to be here. I'm not even implying, I'm sure of it, if he is doing what all these reports have led us to assume he's doing, that is, experimenting with bacteriological warfare in a nice, sane, sensible way. This came to me suddenly after I had done quite a lot of reading, then quite a lot of thinking, and then put myself in his place. I'm a biologist, so is he. Suppose I went to work for you, he looked at Colonel Attenborough, and you assigned me to figure out how to start an epidemic in Moscow through its water supply. Not to start it, mind you, but just figure out how. Would I work in some basement laboratory in Russia where I might get shot if I stuck my head out? The idea is ridiculous. I do research right at home in Fort Detrick, where I'd have unlimited facilities, all the stuff I need, and where I could go for a walk when I felt like it. Mr. Bales said, but what about details on the water system? If I needed details like that, I'd rely on your people to get them for me. Whether I worked at Fort Detrick or in Moscow, I don't think for a minute that Dr. Schutz has gone poking around the Washington water plant, and if somebody else did, some Russian KGB man, and gave him the information, couldn't they have sent it just as well as Novokuznetsk? The fact remains, said Mr. Bales, looking more perplexed and skeptical, that he is here. We've confirmed that beyond doubt. We even know what room he has at the villa, and that he has an assistant, and who he is, a rather nasty character, incidentally, named Georg Wolter. Sure, we know he's here, agreed Fergus. What we don't know is why, but I can guess, and that is, he's here because he wanted to get out of Siberia. You know, said Mr. Bales, I've been thinking the same thing. Colonel Attenborough said, you don't think he's planning to defect? With his record? Said Mr. Bales. Defect to whom? Not to us. We'd try him and clap him in jail. At best, he'd get a life term. I agree. He's better off with the Russians than he would be with us. They can keep him under wraps. We couldn't. And I suppose he knows it. Then what? I think he's up to something else entirely. I think he sold the Russians General what's-his-name, Vasilovsky, a bill of goods. The general's a military man, not a scientist. The outfit running the show is the KGB, Russian intelligence, also not scientists. Schutz made his proposal sound plausible. It does sound plausible. Come to Washington, set up a small laboratory, and check out his new germs in situ, in the very water where they are to be used. I expect the Russians had a few committee meetings about it and decided it was a good idea. Maybe they even gave Schutz extra points for zeal. Also, of course, it's not a very expensive project, considering the objective. Assuming you're right, said Mr. Bales, what have we got? Dr. Schutz is here. He convened to get here. Or he connived to be here. Talked to the Russians into sending him. He's working on a plan to cripple Washington with a deadly epidemic. But that's not the real reason he's here. Then what is? Fergus asked, did you read the von Bülow book? Mr. Bales said, we've both read the chapters on the Stonehead adventure. There wasn't time for more. Interesting, but pretty much a fairy tale. So I thought at first. I don't anymore. I think Dr. Schutz has been working for years on something the Russians don't know anything about. It shows in his papers in a strange sort of way, and it has something to do with that book. You mean all the digressions, the footnotes, and the personnel reports? Yes, but the fact is, I don't think to Dr. Schultz they aren't Yes, but the fact is, I think to Dr. Schultz they aren't digressions at all. They're his main line of research. To him, the germ warfare experiments are digressions. Interesting idea, said Mr. Bales. Have you figured out where it leads? Not very precisely. One thing that puzzles me is why he used that odd method of writing his workup, inserting the material into his BW reports. If he was running a side experiment of his own, why didn't he just keep private notes? Colonel Attenborough looked at Mr. Bales and smiled faintly. The academic background, he said. Lovely. Shall I explain? Without waiting for an answer, he said to Fergus, if you had ever worked at Fort Detrick, you'd know. Keeping private notes is absolutely forbidden. Every scrap of paper is classified, subject to inspection, and believe me, it is inspected. Even the waste baskets are top secret. And when you leave your laboratory, you leave your work clothes behind to be sterilized in the decontamination chamber. Minus your clothes, you yourself get sterilized. There's just no way you can smuggle out any notes, drawings, anything. And I'm sure the Russians are at least as careful. So you see, said Mr. Bales, if your theory is right, and I admit it's one we hadn't thought of, and if Dr. Schutz wanted to keep any records of his side experiments, whatever they were, there's only one way he could have done it, and that's just what you're saying he did. Insert them into his reports. Colonel Attenborough, still looking puzzled, got up and walked to the window, staring out at the meadow and the river beyond. Your theory has logic, he said. Dr. Schutz may have been fooling the Russians, and if he was, he fooled us too. You say there's nothing he can do here that he couldn't do better at Novokuznetsk? That seems reasonable enough, now that you've pointed it out. But here's something else. Quite a few of us have read all those reports from Novokuznetsk. We've been puzzled by those digressions. Our biologists have studied them. And the fact is, if they aren't just meandering little sidelights, they aren't anything at all. They don't mean a thing. You bet they don't, Fergus said cheerfully. They aren't meant to. Schutz was keeping records, but records of what and for what purpose he was careful to conceal. In a way, it's like listening to someone counting in the next room. You could listen to the numbers forever, and it would be meaningless, but once he lets slip the word dollars or sheep or peanuts, then suddenly it all makes sense. Mr. Bales went straight to the core of the apple. And what's the word Dr. Schultz hasn't let slip? Steinkampf. And he did let it slip just once, just for the record. He knew the Russian generals probably couldn't look it up. He counted on that. Mr. Bales sighed. He said, that's an awfully long leap. I know it is, said Fergus rather humbly. And it's a leap backward, but I had to make it. All the way back to an expedition that ended in 1936, and to a concentration camp laboratory in Silesia the Russians blew up in 1945. Back to the job Schutz was assigned by the Nazis in the first place. He's never quit. Breeding the Übermensch, said Colonel Attenborough, the super race. In a sense, but eventually he came up with a new approach. He learned to breed instead the Übermensch. It was easier. You see, he realized that in the long run it doesn't make any difference. Colonel Attenborough murmured, the zombies, the sub-men of Silesia. A crude beginning, Fergus said. He's had 25 years to perfect it since then. To Mr. Bales he added, a long leap, as you said. But what's worse, at the end of it, I've landed in a pothole, which is? I had a few nightmares last night after I figured it out. In one of them, I kept giving injections to a chimpanzee. Then I'd ask it how it felt. And it didn't answer because it couldn't talk. It just sat there. For some reason, this irritated me greatly, and I woke up feeling distressed. When I did, I realized what the dream meant. If Dr. Schutz is doing what I think he's doing, the animals in his zoo aren't any use to him. Did you notice that in all his so-called digressions, there's never a mention of a test animal? This, his own private and peculiar line of work, he's got to have a human subject. Pothole indeed, said Mr. Bales. As I said, we're really quite well informed now on Dr. Schutz's activities, output, requests, receipts, and supplies. A human laboratory subject is something he doesn't have. That is, unless he smuggled one in somehow through a hole in the wall. And that's the end of chapter 15.